There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Mark Richards. Mark is the author of Fundamentals of Software Architecture, Software Architecture, the Hard Parts, and Headfirst Software Architecture, which he co-authored with his friend Neil Ford. Mark's the founder of developer2architect.com, a website devoted to helping developers on their journey to becoming a software architect. He's also spoken at hundreds of conferences around the world and is an experienced software architect involved in the architecture, design, and implementation of distributed systems in a variety of technologies. In this episode of Blue Blazes, Mark and I discuss architecture decision records, an important way to capture all your important architectural decisions, including their context, reasoning, and implications, helping improve communication and collaboration within your projects. Enjoy listening in on our conversation. Hey, Mark, welcome to Blue Blazes.
Oh, well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, really happy to have you and talk about this really interesting and important topic that, as you search for this topic, ADRs or architecture decision records, on the internet, your name comes up an awful lot attached to them. So I think we've kind of
awesome.
got the world expert here. Well, so to just kind of get us started, Mark, for those that haven't heard of a architecture decision record or ADR before, can you briefly describe what they are and how they're used?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, it's interesting since Neil Ford and I really have been evangelizing ADRs since actually, matter of fact, during the writing or before our Fundamentals of Software Architecture book. They were around, but not a lot of people kind of really embraced them. Now it's like almost that SOA buzzword. But yeah, an ADR, an architecture decision record, I mean, quite simply is really a record, a documentation of an architecture decision. And these were actually evangelized back in 2011 by an architect and a friend of mine, Michael Nygaard. And he was, I think, the first one to really start evangelizing this technique of being able to document and record decisions that you make actually as an architect. So that's kind of really concisely, it's a record of an actual decision involving the structure of a system.
Okay. So I've been in some of these meetings, I'm sure you have before too, where, all the lead architects or software developers for a particular project or product are in a room together. And at some point, there's some knockdown, drag out conversation about how something is going to be accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
And all the pros and cons are put on the table. And if it's a good team, there's a little bit of push and pull from everybody to move towards the best solution overall for the particular project. And then at some point, a decision is made. Maybe that's documented in an email. That's a popular choice these days. And then someone goes off and implements something. And then 10 years later, someone's maintaining that code. And how do they have any idea about that email, right? Maybe they didn't even work for the company at the time. So is that kind of a good scenario for what an ADR can help solve?
Oh, is it ever? That plus more. As a matter of fact, Jay, you just described in that little short statement you did three different architectural anti-patterns that occur with that whole scenario you talked about making architecture decisions. The first anti-pattern is an anti-pattern called covering your assets anti-pattern. And if you can picture a mule or a donkey with a blanket over it, that's kind of the symbology of covering your assets. But this is an anti-pattern where an architect is actually afraid of making a decision because they're afraid of making the wrong one.
Hmm.
So the decision just keeps getting deferred and deferred and deferred, and more options thrown out and analyzed, which kind of leads, of course, to the analysis paralysis anti-pattern. Um, but that is actually addressed by actually, well, quite frankly, making decisions. And the art of that piece really comes into something called the last responsible moment, which I've often mused why it's not called the first responsible moment, but it is the last responsible moment, where the cost of making a decision actually starts to become greater than the costs associated with making the wrong decision. And when these
Hmm.
intersect, that really is where that last responsible moment kind of comes in. But let me continue. Once you've made a decision, that enters into what you were describing actually as something called the Groundhog Day anti-pattern. Now, most of you listening have probably remember that old Bill Murray movie called Groundhog Day, a holiday we have here in the United States, very silly, where I think it's February 2nd, a groundhog appears, and if it sees its shadow, you get an extra days of spring or whatever, some silly nonsense. Anyways, the Groundhog Day anti-pattern is coined after that movie where it was February 2nd, time after time after time. And this happens because, as you described, the trade-offs get analyzed, you make a decision, and it continues and continues to get discussed over and over in endless meetings. And the reason is because no one knows why you made that decision. And then that leads to what you also were describing, which is something called EDA. Now, we think of EDA as event-driven architecture, but EDA actually stands for email-driven architecture. And this is all about communicating your decision. ADRs follow and can help in all of those anti-patterns. So,
Okay.
so yeah, it's kind of I couldn't help but just embark on those three architecture anti-patterns that occur when making decisions.
Yeah, yeah.
But yes, in answer to your question, ADRs can significantly help in this, and also create more predictable success. Um, uh, the biggest part is that Groundhog Day anti-pattern. Um,
Hmm.
Addressing the why piece. And this is what I've seen as probably one of the bigger problems when making decisions is we may agree on it, but then you're right, Jay, later on, no one kind of understands why you made that decision. And we
Hmm.
end up getting Groundhog Day anti-pattern again. One of the main parts and purposes of an ADR is to describe the reason, the justification, the why piece of it.
Hmm.
And then the consequences section towards the very end really is an opportunity to describe and document that trade-off analysis. So it acts as a communication vehicle to help avoid email-driven architecture, and also documenting the why to avoid that Groundhog Day anti-pattern.
Okay. I have a joke that I'll do sometimes in some of my architectural talks at conferences where I talk about that first few days on a new project or on a project that predates you that you've joined, and where you're complaining about, why did they do it this way, and this was so stupid, and I can't believe. And then, a year later, if you're still working on that project, usually a lot of that stuff you are like, oh, I see why this was done this way. It just takes that long to acquire all the relevant information, and an ADR could be kind of a shortcut to that.
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, so in our book, The Fundamentals of Software Architecture, Neil Ford and I coined the two laws of software architecture. And the first is that everything in software architecture is a trade-off. And that is what you were referring to with that trade-off analysis that we
Mhm.
that we end up getting sometimes caught into the vortex of. But our second law of software architecture is that why is more important than how. And this was an epiphany of mine back in the around 2011, where I was realizing the reason I was so busy and in so many meetings was because I was trying to find out why something was done that way. We can look at an architecture diagram in different views and certainly see how the system should be implemented and how things work and how things connect. But what we don't understand is why you chose to do it that way. And that is what I found to be the most important aspect of architecture.
Yeah.
And so this is hard to document. And an ADR is a vehicle, an artifact to allow us to record why we did a certain thing and what the options were. And so, and it's very concise. Each architecture decision you make has a corresponding record. And so it does help move forward the progress of a team. So fewer meetings actually to go over, well, why didn't you do it this way? I don't understand why we're not doing it that way. And it really is kind of puts a team back on track, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Keeps you from rehashing some of those conversations as well.
Yes, over and over. Yes.
Yeah. I've been in those meetings for sure. So you might have started getting at this a little bit with your talk about the why, but what do you think are the hallmarks or the pieces or components that are required to make a good ADR?
Yeah. So, you're right. The very first hallmark is that decision section, where we actually include the justification of why I made that decision. And here's what I usually do. I like to have architects, have developers challenge any architecture decision record that I happen to write. And I love this exercise. And anyone out there who's listening that is using an ADR or is planning on using an ADR, please do this. Because, Jay, let's say that you read my ADR and you still disagree with my decision. That's an important piece of information because there's something in that justification that I missed. And that's really important because that justification, you may disagree with it. I may have missed something. And you may have seen, but you didn't take care of address this piece. And it's like, ooh, you know what? You're right. And that may make me change my decision a bit. So I love that exercise of why don't you agree with this? And a lot of times it's interesting, Jay, what I found in that hallmark piece, that decision, that why piece, is doing the extra step to quantify some of your justification. In other words, we expect low request volumes. What does that even mean? Because we don't have a bottleneck, because we expect low request volumes. But that's too ambiguous. So go the extra step and say, in parens, 200 requests a second. Now you've qualified it to say, oh, yeah, there's going to be no bottleneck there. And then follow it by continually saying, and we don't expect any significant increase in those request volumes in the future. So qualifying some of your claims or quantifying some of your claims really does help, because that's where some of the pushback that I've actually gotten is not actually doing the legwork to find out what our scalability needs are, our performance metrics, responsiveness needs, those sort of things. But I will say, though, Jay, a second significant hallmark in an ADR that often goes unlooked is that consequences section. That consequences section allows you as the architect to reflect on what is the impact of this particular decision. And that is where I usually document my trade-off analysis. Because I may have a discussion with a product partner about the trade-off between a certain level of performance in an area of the system and security, because we can't really maximize on both. We have the discussion and say, well, in this case, that sheer raw performance will take a little bit of a sacrifice on security to get that. My question is, where is that documented? except up here. And
Mm.
this is the perfect place to document that trade-off analysis, that conversation that happened. Again, this is helping to keep the team targeted, on track, and not have to constantly question a decision or why we're doing a certain thing. So those two are my favorite pieces, the hallmark of an ADR.
Yeah, that's really useful information. I think another thing that someone who's just getting started with ADRs often would ask is, where do they live? Where do they go? Where do you put them?
Jay, one of the bigger challenges of ADRs. Typically, now personally, I like having ADRs in a wiki. It's accessible to everyone. Everybody knows it's got a link right on the left-hand side menu, so they're easy to find. I prefer that one page per decision. At times when we can't use a wiki, usually I like to put them in documents, and I use ASCII doc, but Markdown's another option. But boy, where to put them? Well, a lot of the recommendations are to put ADRs in the Git repo alongside your code. And that seems to make perfect sense. Here's all the architecture decision records. They're associated with our project. Here's our product, and here's the Git repo. Well, I've had a lot of challenges with that because, first of all, who has access to your Git repo? Well, certainly the developers, but other architects, other stakeholders, maybe operations, others that may need to see and review and understand your architecture decisions and those justifications don't sometimes have access to that repo to get those.
Sure.
And so it becomes an access problem. Now, that said, I really do enjoy using Git to store ADRs. We get metadata for free. We get versioning. We get, when I say metadata, who last updated this? Who approved it? When was it last updated? When was this approved? All of this extraneous data is already there. And also, what I usually do is I will have that in a separate ADR Git repo. So it's not associated with any particular project. Now, the way I solve usually that problem is, and in terms of also organizing the ADRs, is I like to classify architecture decision records. Jay, there are certainly ADRs that pertain to, let's say, a project you and I are working on. And so I will put under applications those specific project directories. That's where those live. But then there's other architecture decision records that maybe are global across all applications, or maybe at an integration or an enterprise level. And so I typically use those kind of classifications as directories so that there's a context for the ADR, enterprise version versus integration. All access to our SAP gateway must go through our Mule ESB. There you go. That applies to any and all applications. So those cross-cutting ADRs, those more enterprise ones, I put inside there.
Okay.
But I will tell you, there's something else that helps a lot of the predictive success of a team and making a team move forward. And that is also to leverage ADRs for standards. So a lot of times as architects, we form standards, and most developers do not like standards. And the reason, Jay, most developers and architects do not like standards is because we don't understand why this particular standard is being thrust upon us, why we have to fill out a database migration form, why we have to do this process, why my code has to sit right here. And I love using ADRs for standards as well. And that happens to be a directory also, either in a shared drive or a Git repo. This is a win-win, Jay, because we get that why piece so that a developer or architect or anybody who that standard is impacting is able to read that standard and understands why it's in place. Okay, if I understand it, I'm more likely to follow it. But here's the other win, and I get excited about this. let's say I am enforcing a standard. I have to write an ADR for it, which means I need to justify it. But better yet, I have to fill out the consequences section. What are the consequences of a team and the development team by enforcing this standard? Am I going to disrupt velocity? Am I going to cause a disruption in the testing flow, the pipeline? These are things that now, as a standards writer, you can actually reflect on and say, you know, it is kind of more a personal preference of the way I like to do things. And that's not a good justification. So
Yeah.
therein lies another use of an ADR aside from just storing architecture decisions. It's any kind of
Yeah,
that
that's a
decision.
great way to kind of underscore what the real purpose of these are. And my aha moment here in this conversation with you, Mark, is
Yeah.
that really it's not just the decision, it's the why that's being documented in these ADRs, and anything that has a why attached to it and is technical could
Yeah.
probably be an ADR,
Yeah.
is what I'm realizing.
Yeah. And you know, Jay, so far we've been spending the last 15, 20 minutes or so talking about just development teams. But there's another aspect of software projects and making them more predictably successful. And that is the engagement with the business.
Mm.
And I have found that an ADR, and even if it's temporal, now, when I say a temporal ADR, I mean an ADR that's used as a communication vehicle, but then just gets discarded. It doesn't have to be stored. You don't have to completely embrace ADRs. But an ADR as a collaboration and engagement tool for your product partners, for your product owner, your product manager, business stakeholders, to be able to understand major architecture decisions, why you made that decision, and the corresponding consequences of that decision. And this is a great collaboration vehicle. Any major architecture refactoring that's going to take up a lot of time and a lot of money and distract the team from maybe some functional work will get pushback.
Mm.
And you start to develop this lack of trust between the what I'll call product partners, and that's the whole business and product ownership and product management, and the development team. And using an ADR really helps as a vehicle to say, this is my decision, this is why I made it, and these are the consequences which I understand. If you disagree, let's have a chat. And it becomes this great collaboration tool. And I've also found the same thing going back to be able to collaborate and have developers more involved with the architecture, which also helps with that predictive success. And to do that, I choose to use the status part on major decisions with a RFC, request for comment, with a particular date. And this allows anybody on the development team to look at the ADR, comment on it, which is why I actually prefer a wiki for this, and basically say, no, I completely disagree. And, or, yeah, but you missed this one part. Can you clarify this? And the point is that request for comment before approving or marking one as pending allows developers to be involved in the architecture decision. And that's also a win. So there's a lot of uses besides just sheer documentation that you can actually, what I call, leverage an ADR for.
Okay. So you just brought up this sort of four-letter word for engineers, documentation. Uh, Fundamentally, I think we could agree that ADRs are a kind of documentation, and that generally speaking, engineers hate to create documentation.
Mhm.
What processes or like ownership have you found is important to establish in a team as far as who's responsible for these, who makes them, what triggers one to be created, who makes the decision that it's being created and writes up the first draft and does that
Mhm.
request for comments and so on?
Yeah. The simple answer to your question is whoever's primarily responsible for making that decision. Usually it's an architect, but a lot of teams don't have an architect, don't have the role of an architect. This is that role, or have the role, not the title. That role is sometimes played by maybe a tech lead or a senior engineer. So the short answer to your question is whoever is responsible for that decision should be the author of that particular ADR. But it's interesting what you said earlier about the struggles with documenting architecture. And too many times, Jay, we rely on the 200-page Word document that just painstakingly describes every aspect of our architecture. Jay, no one's going to read that. And the minute you hit the save button, it's already obsolete. And if you make a change, good luck trying to find that change in that document. Now, I know a lot of companies are under regulations to produce this sort of documentation. But aside from that, what I find is the most effective documentation: diagrams, which show the how, with corresponding ADRs, which point to the why. Jay, that's all we need for architecture documentation. And it starts to become very, very effective. So yeah, that's what I like to use for the documentation, and kind of simply boil it down to those two pieces.
So that reduces the burden on whoever is responsible for this, documentation process. Now they're answering some specific questions, how and why, and they're answering it with diagrams and ADRs. And there isn't this huge, word soup that someone has to come up with to check some boxes for management or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. And so another place where software teams will often document is in the code, right?
Yep.
A lot of times at the beginning of a file, you'll see a header with some comments, or if there's something particularly odd happening in a line of code, you might see a comment that says why that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the line is, and how would you, as an architect or a developer on a team, identify that line where I've now crossed from this being a good inline comment to this being a good ADR?
Sure. So I'm going to revert back to answer that question based on what Michael Nygaard's original quote was when he talked about ADRs. And what he was referring to using ADRs for were for things called architecturally significant decisions. And those are the things that affect the structure of the system, any of our architectural characteristics, those ilities, interfaces, protocols, construction techniques even. Anything that is impacting that structure is where an ADR should be. Quite simply, and I know when we say structure, what does that even mean? It's the physical deployment units and artifacts and the connection between those. That forms the structure of that system. The first place I start with an ADR is something going to impact one of the architectural characteristics that are critical to us: responsiveness, scalability, fault tolerance, maybe it's elasticity, extensibility. If so, that has to be in an ADR. So it really starts getting into a longer discussion, Jay, about the difference between architecture and design, and how you define really that architectural split. But I like Michael Nygaard's architecturally significant criteria. Is that really is a good line to approximate those two camps.
Yeah, that definitely helps clear it up.
Yeah, you did hit a nerve though in your question, and that was about comments and source code. And Jay, we could probably have an entire 1-hour podcast on comments within source code. I don't want you to describe the code. I could read the code. What I really am looking for in a comment is why you chose to code it that way. Now, I like that in inline comments. We don't need an ADR for that. It belongs right with the source code. But Documentation. Here's a great quote that I coined this. Wow, I would say maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Code always tells the truth, but comments sometimes lie. And the point is, we change the code and we forget to change the comments. There you go. I just stop reading comments. But if you're describing why you did something that way, I know not to change it because I understand the rationale, because I have a different way of doing it. Why'd you do it this way? The same thing exists in code as it does within architecture, except we don't have as much documentation. Inline comment is perfect for that. Yeah.
Yeah, the code still compiles and runs fine if the comment is wrong. Right?
That's right. Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah. Well, listen, Mark, there's so much to talk about here. I almost feel like we might have to have a follow-up at some point and do like an advanced ADR, because I have about 20 more questions for you, but we are running low on time. So
okay,
maybe I'll just ask you this one last question. We've been talking about ADRs as a way to help teams more predictably be successful on their software projects. What other technologies or topics or people do you think we should also be talking to or about on this podcast?
Yeah, well, so keeping in line with kind of making projects more predictably successful, one of the things that immediately comes to mind, Jay, is kind of the use of fitness functions, and specifically architectural fitness functions. These are tests that either run triggered in a CI/CD pipeline, for example, or continuous within production. Sometimes we have tools to do this kind of observability. However, where we sometimes get stuck, and why I'm bringing these up, is because functionally, we're at 100%. All the tests are passing, but we can't scale. It doesn't perform. It's not available. It's not fault tolerant. It's not extensible. All of these are the architectural, the structural considerations. And even though we may have a, quote, perfect architecture for scalability, let's say, the way we implement it may actually impact those architectural characteristics. These are not functional tests. These are actually tests about the architecture itself. Doing these upfront, making sure that, as a matter of fact, so in second answer to your question, Neil Ford, my friend and co-author, would be a great person to talk about this stuff, as well as other techniques for basically making software more predictably successful. But embracing these early on gives a form of what is known really as fitness function driven architecture. Knowing where we need to be, measuring that and saying, hey, we're not even close. And then getting to that point really speeds up the software architecture practice, makes it more successful quicker. And also we have that predictability because we have tests that are showing where our SLAs and SLOs, service level objectives, need to be and where we're at with those, as opposed to finished product and saying, oh, yeah, we can't get above 10 users. This is a problem. Now we're completely derailed. So that would be something I'd highly recommend.
Yeah, that sounds like the perfect topic for this podcast. So thanks for the suggestion. And I might have to leverage your connections to talk to Neil about that a little bit. Well, Mark, thanks so much for your time and for your expertise on ADRs. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me on board.
That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.